All right, let's dive into something pretty fascinating, high sensitivity. We're going to deep dive into what it means to be a highly sensitive person, or HSP for short. And you've given me some really interesting stuff to go through, especially this letter by therapist Julie Belland. It's like a guide for medical professionals, like how to understand and support HSPs.
Yeah, and it's a good thing too, because research suggests that like 20 to 30% of people are HSPs. It's way more common than most people think.
Yeah. You know what? I was actually surprised by that number myself.
Yeah,
Okay, so before we get too far, let's define what we're even talking about. When we say highly sensitive, what does that even mean?
exactly.
Scientifically, I mean, is it just like being emotional?
That's a great question, and one that a lot of people get wrong. High sensitivity is actually a scientifically recognized trait called sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS for short. And it's not a disorder, it's not an illness, it's just a fundamental aspect of how a person's nervous system works. They just process information from the world, both internal and external, on a much deeper level than other people.
So thinking back to that 20 to 30% number, if you're listening to this, there's a pretty good chance that you might be an HST or you know somebody who is. What's interesting to me is this letter mentions these different types of HSPs. Can you kind of unpack that for us?
Absolutely. So while high sensitivity itself is considered a neutral trait, it does interact with personality in interesting ways. About 70% of HSPs identify as introverts, so needing more time alone to recharge, while 30% are extroverts, energized by social interaction. But that core sensitivity is there no matter what.
That makes me think about how we often stereotype sensitivity as like a feminine trait. But this shows that it really crosses gender lines, which the letter points out is critical for medical professionals to understand. And speaking of how HSPs experience the world differently, we've got some fascinating brain science to talk about here.
Yes, we do. Research has actually pinpointed three key brain areas that function differently in HSPs. First, the amygdala, which is our brain's alarm system, is more active in HSPs, meaning everyday situations can trigger a stronger, like fight, flight, or freeze response. So it's something to be aware of in terms of your environment and your stress levels. Because HSPs are more susceptible to chronic health issues if they're not prioritizing self care.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'm starting to see already how understanding this could change someone's whole approach to their health.
Exactly. Then there's the insula, which is involved in conscious awareness. HSPs show heightened activity here, meaning that they're noticing subtleties that other people miss. Things like tone of voice, facial expressions, even shifts in the atmosphere.
So if you're an HSP, it's like you've got this built-in radar
Hmm.
for like unspoken cues. Does that resonate with you at all?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And finally, we have mirror neurons, those cells that are linked to empathy. These are also more active in HSPs, which is why they tend to deeply feel other people's emotions, both joy and suffering. Now, while this allows for incredible compassion and connection, it can also lead to feeling overwhelmed if it's not managed well.
Yeah, that makes total sense, especially in the context of this letter being written for medical professionals.
Yeah.
Imagine going to the doctor and being bombarded with all those emotions
Mm.
on top of your own health concerns. It could be really stressful.
Absolutely. And that heightened stress response has real implications for medical care. The letter really emphasizes that doctors need to be aware of potential medication sensitivity in HSPs. Often lower dosages and slower adjustments are needed, and natural alternatives should be explored whenever possible.
So it's not just about prescribing the same medication in the same way,
Yeah.
but really understanding how an HSP's nervous system might react differently. And sometimes it might not be medication at all that's needed, but something else entirely. It's about that individualized approach.
Yeah, it really is. And this is where awareness of high sensitivity is so important because the letter points out the real risk of misdiagnosis. HSPs might exhibit symptoms similar to conditions like sensory processing disorder, ADHD, anxiety, or depression, but the root cause is different.
Oh, wow. And that's where I imagine things can get tricky.
Yeah.
How do we tease apart those nuances, especially if someone isn't even aware they're an HSP?
That's a great point. You've hit on the crux of it. For example, an HSP experiencing sensory overload in a busy waiting room might look like they have ADHD when it's simply their nervous system being overstimulated. Recognizing high sensitivity as a fundamental trait, not a pathology, is a massive step in providing proper care.
So we've got this trait that affects how people process the world, get these brain differences, and now we're seeing how that can play out in medical settings. It seems like childhood experiences would be particularly important for HSPs, and the letter seems to confirm that.
Yeah, you're right. Research does show that HSPs are more deeply affected by their childhood environments, both positive and negative. Supportive, nurturing childhoods allow HSTs to really thrive. But adverse experiences can have a more profound impact. leading to all sorts of challenges later in life.
And this is where this deep dive gets really personal, because if you're listening and you're thinking, wait, this is me,
Mm-hmm.
then understanding these potential challenges
Mm.
becomes critical.
Right, absolutely. The letter lists a whole cascade of potential challenges, from higher levels of stress and anxiety to chronic health conditions like headaches or digestive issues. HSPs might struggle with low self-esteem, sleep problems, even adrenal fatigue, all stemming from feeling different or not having their needs met.
So knowing all this, what can medical professionals, and really anyone who interacts with HSPs, do to create a more supportive environment?
Well, Julie Jelland offers some really practical suggestions in her letter, starting with the medical environment itself. Think scent-free spaces, dimmer lighting, soft seating. It's about minimizing sensory overload and creating a sense of calm.
It's really fascinating how these small changes can make such a big difference.
Right, and think about the approach to medical procedures, explaining everything clearly beforehand, giving extra time to process information, checking in regularly during the procedure. It's a gentler, more sensitive approach that honors the HSP's needs.
And that leads us to the question of mental health considerations for HSPs. Because clearly this way of experiencing the world can be stressful.
Oh, it can be. The letter points out that HSPs often carry higher levels of stress. Just from navigating a world that's not really designed for their sensitive nervous systems, they're processing so much more information. So it's easy to feel overloaded and exhausted. And, this can really impact their mental health.
It's almost like they're always on, absorbing everything around them. What comes to mind for me is that idea of emotional sponges that I've heard used to describe HSPs. Is that accurate, or is it more nuanced than that?
I think it's a good analogy. Though it's important to remember that HSPs aren't just passively soaking up emotions. They're actively processing and empathizing with them. And that takes energy, which is why setting healthy boundaries is so crucial for HSPs.
The letter talks about HSPs having a tendency towards overgiving, which makes sense if they're naturally attuned to others' needs. So learning to say no becomes a critical skill for them to protect their own energy and well-being.
Exactly. It's not about becoming selfish, but it's about recognizing their own limits and honoring their need for self-care. The letter also highlights the tendency towards perfectionism in HSPs, which can lead to a lot of self-criticism and pressure.
I can see how that would be amplified for HSPs,
Right.
given their heightened awareness and tendency to overthink things. If every detail feels important, it's easy to get caught in that cycle of trying to get everything perfect.
Right, and that's where self-compassion comes in. Learning to be kind to themselves, to embrace their imperfections, is a huge step towards mental well-being for HSPs. And it ties in with another key point that the letter emphasizes, the need for downtime.
Yeah, this stood out to me too. It almost feels counterintuitive in our go, go, go culture.
It does. But for HSPs, downtime isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. Ideally, they need about 2 hours of unstructured alone time each day, a full day off each week, and even a week off each season to truly recharge.
Wow, that's a significant amount of time. But I can see how essential that would be to avoid burnout. It's like their nervous systems need that time to decompress and reset.
Right.
But what does that downtime actually look like? Is it just about being alone? Or are there specific activities that are particularly restorative for HSPs?
That's a great question. While being alone is often necessary, downtime can also include things like spending time in nature, practicing mindfulness, or engaging in creative activities. Anything that allows their nervous system to settle and replenish.
So it's not just about the absence of stimulation, but about finding activities that nourish and restore them. This makes me think about your own life. What are some things that you do to recharge and create that sense of calm?
For me, nature is essential. A quiet walk in the woods, listening to the birds, feeling the sun on my skin. It's like hitting the reset button for my nervous system. And mindfulness practices like meditation help me to stay grounded and manage the intensity of my emotions.
That makes sense. And those practices can be incredibly powerful tools for HSPs to regulate their nervous systems and find moments of peace. As the letter points out, it also mentions a whole array of resources specifically for HSPs. It's like Julie Jelland wanted to make sure that anyone reading this letter knew that they weren't alone.
She really did. The letter is packed with links to websites, podcasts, books, online communities. There's even a directory of therapists who specialize in working with HSPs. This wealth of resources really speaks volumes about the growing awareness and support for this trait.
Yeah, I was really impressed by that, especially considering this letter was written for medical professionals. It's almost like she's saying, hey, if you're a doctor who encounters HSPs, here's everything you need to understand and support them better. It's like a call to action for more compassionate and informed healthcare.
It is, and I think that's a critical piece of this whole conversation. It's not just about individual HSPs adapting to the world, it's about the world adapting to them.
Yeah.
We need to design our spaces, our systems, our interactions with sensitivity in mind.
Yeah, that's a huge shift in perspective.
Yeah.
And one that I think a lot of people, including myself, aren't even aware of.
It is. Think about how much of our world is designed for the non-HSP majority.
Oh.
The constant noise, the bright lights, the relentless stimulation. It can be incredibly overwhelming for someone who processes everything on a deeper level.
So it's not just about creating designated quiet spaces,
Mm-hmm.
but about a fundamental shift
Mm-hmm.
in how we approach design and functionality in all areas of life.
Exactly. Imagine a world where we considered the needs of HSPs in the design of our schools, our workplaces, our public spaces. A world where sensitivity wasn't seen as a weakness, but as a valuable asset.
It would be a world where everyone,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of their sensitivity level, could feel more comfortable and supported. That's something I think we can all get behind, even if we're not HSPs ourselves.
Absolutely. The benefits of creating a more sensitive world extend far beyond just those who identify as HSPs. It would mean a world with less stress, more compassion, and a deeper appreciation for the richness of human diversity.
I love that vision. So how do we start making that vision a reality? How do we help HSPs to not only survive, but truly thrive in a world that doesn't always understand it? What does that support look like?
Well, I think it starts with validation. For so long, HSPs have been told they're too sensitive, too emotional, too much. We need to challenge that narrative and celebrate their sensitivity as the strength that it is.
It's like we need to shift that internalized message
Yeah.
from something's wrong with me to I'm wired differently and that's okay.
Exactly. It's about helping them understand that their sensitivity is not a burden, but a gift. It allows them to experience the world with incredible depth and nuance, to connect with others on a profound level, and to create beauty and meaning in ways that others might not even imagine.
So rather than trying to dampen their sensitivity, it's about helping them to manage it effectively and harness it as a source of power.
Precisely. And that involves equipping them with the tools and resources they need to thrive. Things like mindfulness, meditation, nature immersion, and creative expression can be incredibly helpful for HSPs to regulate their nervous systems and find moments of peace and restoration. It's about helping them build that self-care toolkit that we talked about earlier.
I can see how those practices would be particularly beneficial for HSPs, given their heightened awareness and emotional sensitivity.
Yeah.
But beyond those individual strategies, how do we create a more supportive environment? On a societal level, what would a truly sensitivity-friendly world look like?
It's like we need a whole paradigm shift.
Right.
Not just tweaking things here and there, but really rethinking how we design our world from the ground up.
Yeah, you're right. It would mean incorporating sensory considerations into architecture and urban planning. Think about things like sound-absorbing materials in public spaces, natural light and ventilation in buildings, even designated quiet areas in workplaces and schools.
Right, like actually thinking about that.
Yeah, and it goes beyond the physical environment, too. It's about how we interact with each other. What are some ways we can bring more sensitivity into our everyday communication and relationships?
I think active listening is a big one. Really
Yep.
taking the time to hear what someone is saying, not just waiting for our turn to talk. Being mindful of our tone of voice and our nonverbal cues. Being patient with processing time. And creating space for different emotional expressions.
So it's about slowing down, paying attention, and being more attuned to the subtle nuances of communication. And isn't that something that we could all benefit from, whether we're highly sensitive or not?
Absolutely. Cultivating sensitivity in ourselves makes us better communicators, better listeners, better friends, partners, and colleagues. It enhances our empathy, and it deepens our connection with others.
And who knows? Maybe by becoming more sensitive ourselves, we can start to influence the culture as a whole.
Yeah.
It's like a ripple effect, right?
Exactly. As we embrace sensitivity in our own lives, we start to model it for others. And gradually, those small shifts in behavior can lead to larger changes in society. The letter actually encourages people to share it widely, which I think speaks to that. Julie Jelen really had that ripple effect in mind.
It's really powerful to think about. And speaking of powerful, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on the incredible strengths that HSPs bring to the table.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to focus on the challenges, but we can't forget about the gifts.
Right. Absolutely. High sensitivity comes with a unique set of strengths. HSPs are often deeply intuitive and insightful, able to see patterns and connections that other people miss. They tend to be incredibly creative, bringing a unique depth and richness to their artistic expressions.
It's like they see the world in high definition, noticing all the subtle details and nuances that others might overlook.
Exactly, and that heightened awareness makes them incredibly empathetic and compassionate. They're often the ones who truly understand others' feelings and offer genuine support, and they tend to be highly conscientious, detail-oriented, and deeply committed to their values.
These are qualities that are so valuable in our world, especially in fields like healthcare, education, the arts, and social justice.
Absolutely. HSPs often feel called to make a positive difference in the world, and their sensitivity allows them to approach these fields with a depth of understanding and compassion that is truly remarkable.
So as we conclude this deep dive, I think it's important to remember that high sensitivity is not a weakness, but a superpower. It's about depth of processing, not fragility. It's about experiencing the world in a more nuanced and profound way.
Yeah, beautifully put. And as we learn to understand and embrace this superpower, both in ourselves and in others, we can create a world that honors the full spectrum of human experience, a world where sensitivity is not just tolerated, but celebrated as the gift that it truly is.
This deep dive has given us so much to think about. But what stands out to you? Has any of it resonated with you on a personal level? If so, what's one small step that you could take today to create a more sensitivity-friendly environment for yourself or for someone else? Remember, embracing sensitivity isn't just about HSPs. It's about all of us tapping into our shared humanity and creating a world that's more compassionate, more understanding, and more attuned to the beautiful complexity of human experience.
That's right. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about, but remember, it's just the beginning. The more we learn about high sensitivity, the more we can appreciate its power and potential, and the more we can create a world where sensitivity is seen not as a liability, but as a strength.